So here's another term that I hope feels like review. This is from the last unit, but since we didn't have a quiz for the letter to the editor unit, I want to make sure you have confirmation bias written down somewhere so it's obvious to you that it is a quiz term that will show up on the quiz upcoming. This cartoon is the simplified version, but it does make the point. I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. It's time to make my own choice based on my own research to find the real truth. And of course, Google is nothing if not a butler that likes to hand you something on the top of the tray that's exactly what you wanted to see. But keep in mind, for the full definition, you just want to acknowledge that your brain likes things that it likes. It likes to take on board information that that confirms its pre-existing biases. So underline these two terms for the quiz itself. Underline it could be a conscious or unconscious process. So certainly it could be conscious where it's deliberate. You already have a strong political belief and you look up something on Google and the framing, the wording of your Google search is kind of designed to produce confirmation, right? It is designed to give you and feed you information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs. The sneakier one is the unconscious stuff, where your brain doesn't even know it's doing that. Your brain is getting information from both sides, but it's only absorbing the stuff that confirms what you already believe. So keep in mind, it could be happening deliberately. I'm going to go out and find stuff that proves that I'm correct, or it could be subconscious. Well, I don't know, but underneath your brain is doing some processing subconsciously, where it's just remembering and storing the stuff that proves that you're right and tending to dismiss the stuff that may contradict your worldview. Also, from that same unit, we talked about steel manning, which is just a generous good faith effort to present the opponent's point of view before you take it down. So you're like legitimately trying to get inside their head, understand and reproduce their argument so that you're attacking the argument, not necessarily the person. We may come back to this. A lot of you kind of struggled with steel manning, but keep in mind it's a good persuasive technique. It works well for verbal arguments or verbal tussles, and it's good exercise for your brain to force yourself into your opponent's head, kind of Sun Tzu art of war style, so that you can use those jujitsu moves to attack the right pressure points as opposed to only attacking the person or the personality of the argument. So for the quiz, just remember that steel manning is generous, good faith attempt at reproducing the argument, right? So it's going to be done with some goodwill, some generosity, and you're really trying to legitimately understand and present an opposing point of view before you start trying to attack or break down that argument. All right, another term from the last unit that is going to be on the quiz, but also will be important in terms of the next essay, and maybe especially on the last essay of the semester, is emotional authenticity. That's one of those vocab terms that basically means what it sounds like it means. You're being emotionally authentic or emotionally real. For most of you, all that means in the essay is you pick a topic that you have some kind of an emotional connection to, and that should just naturally grow out of your topic. So in other words, if you pick a topic that has some emotional through line or connection to you, this should take care of itself. It's hard to fake anyway. The 2 to 4% of you, which incidentally is 5 to 6 people statistically that I'm talking to right now, are clinically diagnosable psychopaths. You don't have the capacity for emotional authenticity, but you're also probably good at faking it. So even you should be able to benefit from writing that reflects the emotion that also enhances the message itself. So if you're writing an essay about the diary of Anne Frank, presumably that essay should have a sense of sincerity, a sense of acknowledgement of the scope and the trauma and the seriousness of that situation. But if you're writing about Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson, you can be a little bit more lively or a little more sarcastic or a little bit more bubbly, and that's okay as long as you're consistent all the way through the essay. The tone reflects the message. Again, you pick a good topic, this will basically take care of itself. All right, this gets us to the end of kind of review and into what I would think of as the new unit or issues directly related to this next paper. I got rid of lateral issues. If you wrote that down, good, but put a little X next to it for the quiz. I'm not going to have lateral issues dealt with directly, but instead we are going to talk about lateral thinking. They're similar. If you remember that lateral issues are issues that are to the side or lateral of the main issue in an article. Lateral thinking is thinking that is to the side or a less direct approach to a problem. So the word lateral works in the exact same way for both terms. And I'm using lateral thinking for this unit to be the catch-all for outside the box thinking, innovation, and creativity as applied to problem solving. So I'm applying lateral thinking to all of those. It qualifies for all of those concepts. So if you just remember innovative, outside the box, or something about creativity, those are the three key words for your flashcard definition. And then you'll know that anytime you're trying to come up with a really bonkers, bananas solution to a problem, as we did in 2 of the homework assignments, that was you practicing lateral thinking or thinking outside the box. Okay, here's some brand new material. This is where I actually have to make some pretty ruthless cuts to the course material. This is where I actually have to get pretty aggressive about what I'd like to keep in the course, but what I know I should try to minimize or set aside so that you have enough time to do the essay justice and really tweak and adjust and draft the essay as much as you need to. Suffice it to say that what you're looking at on this one slide, I would normally spend like a week and a half to 2 weeks on if we were doing the seated version of this class. Another way to think of it is dollar for dollar, cause and effect logic might be one of the things from this class that are most applicable to other classes. Like if you're looking for one concept that you can take straight to a math class when you deal with logic sets in math, or straight to a philosophy class when you're talking about logical biases, or straight to a psychology class where they're doing studies and try to tease out causation versus correlation. I would argue this is the most mappable skill to other classes, but I'm not going to spend as much time because I don't think it will help you as much for the actual writing. So keep in mind, I think of this as extremely important generally for other academic settings and maybe for life and just absorbing information, but I'm not going to spend as much time as I really, really want to. But keep in mind, cause and effect is the heading. That's kind of the unit. That's the one half of the paper that involves more logic, more a sense of utilizing the rational forebrain. So you've got your creativity over here, but you've got this more logical, methodical look at analyzing data. And here's your 3 new terms. So these will all be on the quiz. And I'm just going to try to do as short a version as I possibly can for each of these terms so that they basically make sense. And if you can apply them to the essay, excellent. But if you only kind of memorize them basically for the quiz, at least you're doing so with some concepts that are very mappable onto a lot of the other college classes that you're going to take. And if you're going to go out into the world and try to absorb information intelligently and figure out your place, purpose in a world of complex, abstract ideas, dollar for dollar, I'll argue that these are some of the most important concepts of the class. So here we go. So ultimately where we want to get to here is causation versus correlation. Think of that as like the ore at the bottom of the well. That's like the essential concept. So I want to make sure you can define causation versus correlation just in terms of flashcard definitions. But if you can wrap your head around the implications of that relationship and the difference between those two concepts, again, very valuable skill, dollar for dollar, to take out into other college classes and in fact out into the world of real ideas. So I'm going to define those, but I'm going to define them at the end because the terms in yellow give you some foundation so you can understand these terms maybe a little bit more clearly. Let's start with variables. Think of any time something happens, that's an effect, and there may be an obvious cause of that effect, but you always want to look for additional variables, and that just means other causes that may have influenced it. So just imagine a car accident. A guy and a girl have crashed into each other at an intersection, and you're the witness, and you saw that the girl was texting. So immediately, your causal explanation is, well, so-and-so is texting, so she must have been negligent, so that caused the accident. The accident here is the effect. You're going to immediately assume that the girl on her cell phone is the main cause, the proximate cause of the effect. And so that's a reasonable interpretation, but you want to look for other variables. If you're going to think critically, you want to say, well, what was the weather like? That's a variable that could be taken into account. you might find out that the guy was actually drinking alcohol. So if his blood alcohol content was above 0.09, then that's a variable that certainly would need to be factored into any legal ramifications. Maybe ultimately you find out that the girl's brakes were dysfunctional and you thought she was on her phone, but she was actually just getting ready to call the service station because she was having trouble with her brakes the entire time. In other words, you don't want to just go by your first assumption and assume that straight line, here's the obvious cause, here's the effect, and just stop there assuming you know the entire case. So variables are the additional things that may have led to any specific outcome. The main point with variables is you just want to look for as many as you can. So you're trying to not just assume that immediate first interpretation, but step back and look for additional variables or additional factors that may have led to any given effect. So the next term to consider is the word tendency. I'd actually practice saying this one out loud because in verbal debates it can actually be a really good hedge against an overgeneralization. You know, say all people who drive Fords are like this. You say there's a tendency of Ford drivers to blank. So just in terms of having verbal debates, it's a good tool. But think of tendency as a general pattern, and in particular, keeping the previous term variables in mind. Tendency you can think of as two variables that tend to go together. The easiest and the most essential has to do with gender. And as soon as I step on the landmine of the word gender, I hear a little click. I'm like, no, should I step on that landmine? In this case, yes, because I think 99% of you will be able to agree with the basic premise that there is a tendency to have a correlation, and we'll get to that one, between height and gender. So here's the difference between like a rule and a tendency. The tendency is if you're male, what? You're going to tend to be a little bit taller than the average female. And the idea here is that it's not a rule, it's not ironclad. If you are tall, that means you're a man, or if you're short, that means you're a woman. But you understand it statistically that over time, if you're looking at thousands of people comparing men and women, and also thinking about other variables like diet or culture or genetics, but on average, there is a tendency, and you can say it's a general rule that is true more than it's not true, that if you're a male, you're going to be a little bit taller. If you're a female, you're going to be a little bit shorter. That's pretty abstract. Some of you may suddenly light up when you see that represented by scatterplot. So if this clears things up, you say, all right, I generally agree that men tend to be taller and women tend to be shorter. Those of you who are a little bit more literal or mathematically minded, you may appreciate the visualization knowing that there's outliers. So again, the word tendency means it's a general pattern, but the outliers are out here, right? So let's say this axis is men, this axis is women. You'll note that the incidence of tall men seems to match the incidence or correlate with the incidence of shorter females on average, but your outliers are an incredibly tall Amazon over here. You've got the short guys possibly dealing with some Napoleon complexes down here. So it is not an ironclad rule, it's just a general statistical pattern that seems to be replicable over time. So again, for the quiz, all you have to know about a tendency is it's a general rule or a general pattern, but of course there are going to be exceptions to that. All right, here's where it might get a little tricky or a little bit more slippery when I start talking about the arrow of causality. It sounds like a dumb MacGuffin from a Marvel movie. We have to find the arrow of causality to save humanity. Well, quite possibly. Think of the arrow of causality is which came first. If you just wrote that down, that might simplify things. But if you're trying to look at whether or not A caused B or what other variables might be in play, the arrow of causality is a fun little thought experiment. I'm using the word fun, but look what I do for a living, in which you just think about revising or reversing the explanation. So the whole point of the arrow of causality is you might explain it as A causes B, but what happens if you just ask the question, is it possible that B is also causing A? So the first thing to think about is the wine drinker study, where we talked about people who drink wine, that sounds like A, and it sounds like that causes them to live longer and have better health outcomes. So you say, well, it certainly could be true that A, drinking wine, causes B, longer lifespan. That makes intuitive sense. But if you reverse the arrow and you say something like, does longer lifespan cause wine drinking? That doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's where you start looking for additional variables. What other things cause a longer lifespan? A healthier diet. The Mediterranean diet in particular. Think about whose grocery cart has things like beer and also potato chips and also chicken wings. That's my grocery cart, by the way. That might go along or correlate with a shorter lifespan, whereas somebody who drinks wine is probably more likely to be well off and to be eating healthier food, and they can afford the organic kale. And so it's really not that drinking red wine causes better health, it's that better health is over here. And if you reverse that, you say people who are healthier and wealthier may tend to pick wine over beer or over Pepsi. So reversing the arrow of causality doesn't always work, but it's an easy way to practice the exercise, right? It could be true that drinking wine causes a healthier lifestyle, but it certainly is likely as well that people who are generally healthier are more likely to drink wine. So reversing the arrow may give you one way to start looking for additional variables or figure out what's going on beneath the surface. All right, I want to run you through just a few case studies or examples, because seeing the examples might help make the point better than just trying to describe it. Excuse me. Take two. So I just want to try to run you through a few examples or thought experiments with the arrow of causality to see if real-world situations make more sense. So these are all based on actual scientific studies. So I'm going to give you a correlation, two variables that kind of tend to go together, and we'll just talk about what happens if you have the arrow of causality go one way versus if you have it go the other way. So let's start nice and cheerful with divorce and mental illness. Studies have indicated for a long time there is a relationship, a correlation between higher levels of divorce and higher levels of mental illness. So if I was just to ask you right now, what do you think comes first? So the arrow of causality, again, can be reduced to one thing comes first and then it leads to or causes the other thing. So just right now, off the top of your head, would you guess more often what comes first, divorce or mental illness? This is about 65 to 70% of you that if I had made this a classroom experiment would have said, well, it sounds like the event comes first. The divorce happens, and then that might lead to things like feelings of loneliness, feelings of inadequacy, more heavy drinking, more self-destructive behavior, all of which can start to reinforce each other and put you at a great deal of risk for mental illness. That should make intuitive sense. If you already are ahead of me and thought to yourself, well, people who are mentally ill are probably more likely to be in volatile relationships, they're more likely to be in the kind of relationship that is rocky and tumultuous, and so if you already have a tendency towards mental illness, and it could be any number of things from borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety, that means you might be more likely to marry the kind of person that you divorce. Does that make sense? So I picked this example because it probably goes both ways. So if you divorce somebody, but you're perfectly healthy, you're a reasonable, rational, healthy person, but then you get divorced, that could lead to a higher incidence of mental illness. But it could be that people who already tend towards mental illness will also be drawn. So you can argue the mental illness causes the divorce through the bad coping strategies and the kind of failure to deal with situations in real time. So this is a case where you want to just practice going back and forth. The arrow of causality with this relationship, with this tendency, probably goes both ways. So let's look at an example where it's hopefully more obvious that the arrow can only really move in one direction or the other. Here are two things that often correlate. If we were going to graph it on a scatter plot, there tends to be a relationship between wheelchairs and injuries. And if I was just going to ask you which came first, or on average, which tends to come first, the wheelchair or the injury, you'd probably pretty logically and quickly come up with the answer that normally you'd have to be injured for there to be the presence of a wheelchair. So you'd say the injury causes the need or the necessity for a wheelchair. But take a moment and pretend you're an alien from another planet and you don't know not from nothing, and all you do is arrive on the planet Earth. and you just note the correlation. Every time you see somebody in a wheelchair, you note that they're injured. So you could conclude something like, stay away from wheelchairs because obviously they cause injuries. So you want to ask yourself, does the arrow move both ways in certain situations? It can. In this one, no, it's actually pretty comfortable. If you made the claim, wheelchairs cause injuries, I'm sure it's happened, but that's a very tiny percentage. The tendency would be that if you get injured badly enough, then you will need a wheelchair. So the only really logical arrow here is the bottom one that suggests injuries are going to come first. Wheelchairs are going to be the outgrowth of that initial cause. Okay, let me give you two more examples with the arrow of causality in play. It seems like I'm spending a lot of time on this, but that's because I think it's really important if you can just practice trying to think from both directions, approaching the same explanation and reverse engineering it and seeing if it gives you any new insights into variables that might be in play. I'm going to give you one nice visual example that, if this still isn't making sense, if you think of the windmill example of the arrow of causality, that may really help you remember it. And if that still doesn't work, I'm going to give you a true to life, you as a student example that might help you kind of absorb basically the same principle of causation versus correlation from the wine study, but in your own life as a student, if we ever go back to having classes in person. So think of what a windmill is, think of the action of a windmill, and most of you, I'd say the brilliant 97% of you would be able to get this right. If I said, look at a windmill, think about how a windmill works, and make sure you put these two elements of the action of the windmill in the correct order. In other words, what comes first, the wind or the turbines moving? So most of you would be able to line these three variables up in play and know the wind comes first, that makes the blades move, and the result, the effect of that action is electricity, right? So start with wind, that leads to turbines moving, that gets you the ultimate effect of electricity. That makes sense. So you should be able to say pretty obviously with a windmill, you can chart the arrow of causality. You need wind first, that creates the turbines to move, that gives you the ultimate effect of electricity. So then the question is, what would happen if you reversed the arrow? In other words, if you reverse the arrow of causality to suggest, does it make any sense if you said, well, there might be electricity out there that moves turbines, that creates wind? Now think of this from the alien's perspective. The alien lands on the planet Earth. Again, they don't know not from nothing. And they notice the correlation. Every time it's windy, the turbine's blades are moving. So they actually might conclude this. They might say, well, the Earthlings need the giant wind machines because every time it's windy, the blades are moving. So I, as the alien, am going to naturally assume humans like wind. They decided to create these giant machines to create an atmosphere that moves air from one place to another. That would sound ridiculous on the large scale, but some of you have probably already figured out that on the small scale, we've already done that. Human beings do like wind, and we actually have created a device where you start with the electricity. Now the electricity is the essential cause. The first effect is that the turbines move, and the ultimate effect is that it's wind. So it actually makes perfect sense to reverse the arrow of causality, and it just depends on what scale you're working at. So if you're outside, you want the arrow to go from, I want wind to move the turbines to give me electricity, but then if you're inside, you want the exact opposite arrow of causality. I have some electricity inside, it's hot out, so I want turbines to move, and that creates wind, giving me a cooling effect. So this is a nice clear-cut case where it's 50-50. It depends on whether or not you're inside or outside as to which arrow of causality works best. Okay, let me just give you one more example of the arrow of causality and how it can be an easy way to start dealing with causation versus correlation. I'd rather do like another 10 of these, but again, it's not as important for the essay. So let me just run you through a real-world example based on actual science and research that could affect you if we ever get back into seated classes, because it's literally about where you sit in class or what your seat is in the class. So here is the correlation first, and if you like the idea of the scatter plot, if that Kind of helps you visualize things. This clearly isn't to scale, but it is correct in its tendency. And here's how you'd read this. So up here, you'd have kind of A students. It would go A, B, C, D, E, and then here down to F. Down here, you have seat row. So literally over here is the front of the class. And as you move this way on the axis, you're getting closer to the back of the class. And think about what that means. It's basically a tendency or a general pattern that the people who sit in the front of class up here also tend to get better grades. So the general pattern, the general tendency is the further in front of class you are, the better your overall grade tends to be. Don't forget, there's outliers. This is an A up here. So this is somebody who's sitting in the 6th row. They're in the back of class, and this guy can be half asleep. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's going to get an A anyway. By the way, we hate that student. That's our least favorite. But we also know about these characters here. They're sitting in the front of the class. They're trying. Their mother said, if you sit in the front of the class, you'll get better grades. But they're still going to get a D or an F anyway. So those outliers exist. There is a tendency or a general pattern, though, that people towards the front of the class tend to do better. People in the back of the class tend to do worse. So start with your first explanation. What would you do with the arrow of causality? Would you say the seat row comes first and then leads to the effect of a better grade? And what might happen if you reverse that? In class, if I just asked you that, incidentally, oftentimes it's somebody in the back row who wants to answer that first, which is fantastic for psychological reasons. But usually, like I would say, 8 out of 10 students will tend to assume the arrow of causality goes in this order. You sit in the front of the class, and then you get a better grade. So what kind of variables are in play? If you sit in the front, then you're closer to the teacher. You're less likely to be distracted. You are able to just get a better picture of the class notes. So you might be able to take in information from a sensory standpoint. So that all makes it sound like the arrow goes in this direction. If you sit in front, then you'll get a good grade. And of course, it stands to reason. If you sit in the front, then you'll get a bad grade. So the arrow's still going the same direction. It's saying you choose where you sit, and then the effect of that will be your grade outcome, or the tendency of your grade outcome. If you reverse that, it's going to sound weird at first. Does your grade determine where you sit? And think about that. Try to sit with it for long enough to say, getting an A causes me to sit in front of the class. Doesn't quite work. Maybe you got an A last semester. If I got an A last semester, it's not the A that's determining where I sit. So what are some other variables? And here's where you might start to think about, well, what do A students do? A students tend to sit in the front of the class, but they also tend to eat breakfast, where an F student may tend to not eat breakfast. If you're the kind of student that sits in the front and eats breakfast, you're probably also the kind of student whose parents made them do their homework and forced you to have a family dinner where you sat down and talked about your day. In other words, those things may have come first. So it's not the grade necessarily steering where you sit, but it's the kind of A student who already eats breakfast, variable 1, already has family dinner, variable 2, already is used to studying and kind of creating a structure for themselves, and then that determines where they sit in the class. The reason that's important, like with the wine study, is you can't take an F student and say, if you sit in the front of the class, then you'll get an A. I mean, it probably doesn't work that way. It's not that simple that the arrow only goes in one direction. Just as if you took an A student and you stick them in the back with the people who are on their cell phones and the only sound they make is their head hitting the wall as they fall asleep, that A student's probably going to do fine. They may struggle a little bit, but you're not going to take an A student and turn them into an F student. So it's probably not where you sit that determines your grade. It's just two variables that correlate. They go together, but you don't want to ignore the additional variables in play based on the ultimate effect. So that seat row example is probably the cleanest and the easiest, because you may have experienced it in your own life, the cleanest and easiest way to explain the actual terms themselves, correlation versus causation. It's well known that there is a correlation, a connection, a general tendency that where you sit in class has some kind of a connection or relationship to your grade. And the whole point of the arrow of causality is you don't want to just stay with your first assumption. You may assume if you sit in the front of the class, then that will lead to the outcome, the effect of getting a better grade. You want to acknowledge other variables. Similarly, causation implies a pretty clean, logical, this thing happened and it caused the second thing to happen. Some cases that can be pretty clear cut, like with wheelchairs. If you're in a wheelchair, that was likely caused by the injury first. The injury came first, and then that led to the outcome of you being in a wheelchair. But many situations, and I would argue most situations, are probably more complicated than that straightforward assumption of causality. So anytime you hear somebody make a reference to causation versus correlation, think of the seat row example. It certainly could be true that sitting in the front causes you to pay more attention, causes you to absorb a little bit more information, causes you to be a better student, and that's true. But you don't want to assume that's the only variable. There's always other variables in play, like people who sit in the front of the class also tend to eat breakfast, and they also tend to have parents that might be more strict about homework standards and taking care of business. So the simple explanation sometimes will work. It doesn't always. Sometimes reversing the arrow of causality might get you a few extra variables, and it's just your brain practicing coming up with multiple explanations so you don't settle for the first most simple or what might be the most obvious cause. So in terms of the actual essay, I'm not suggesting by any means that you have to use every single one of these terms in your essay. You don't have to like build them into the context of the essay. But if you are familiar with them enough to do okay on the quiz, and you can actually get good enough with the arrow of causality, it could help. It could boost your overall grade. So for instance, you're the nurse talking about narcissistic doctors with God complexes. Of course, one causal explanation of that might be men are alpha assholes. That's your explanation. That's the cause that leads to the effect of doctors getting too much power and turning into narcissistic nightmares to live with. You're going to sound more intelligent, and you're going to have a better set of solutions if you can look at additional variables, psychological variables, the stratification of a workplace environment, how certain behaviors get rewarded and other behaviors get squelched. So you just want to not settle for any one initial causal explanation. You want to step back, look for multiple variables. If you don't really assess the problem and the causes of the problem effectively, that means you won't be able to come to an effective solution. So the better you can analyze the causes of what you want to fix, the better the solution will be. All right, that's good enough for me for one night. I can only imagine how you feel if I'm getting sick of the sound of my own voice yet again. Email with questions. Let me know if you're interested. I'm going to try to do a Q&A session on Monday. For your section, it's going to be at 4 o'clock. So keep that in mind. If you're curious, we can do some sample quiz questions, maybe in a game show format, if you're interested. Otherwise, take care of each other out there. I still haven't checked to see who the president is, so I'm still in Schrodinger's presidential box. Feel free to look that up and send me a paragraph for extra credit. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Take care.